So the first topic that we will be discussing is the history of postmodernism. The first question that we have to ask is, what is postmodernism? Postmodernist philosophy refers to a movement in philosophy in response to the modernist style of ideals that developed during the Enlightenment. So this includes people like Descartes and Locke. They theorized the world in a very rationalist lens that placed emphasis on things like logic, evidence, and reasoning. Postmodernists reject this because Descartes and Locke will use this to create one singular truth about the world, and postmodernists don't believe that that can exist. Essentially, the entire ideas of like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, justice are all things that postmodernists reject. Not to say that they don't believe in justice, but rather they disagree in how those ideals were derived. They are also connected by a singular truth, by rejecting a singular truth, and an emphasis on how power is created and constructed. While people like Locke will politically say that we have a social contract, which is how power is constructed, they will ask why is the need for power in the first place and what is the creation of these power differentials. So the first precursor to postmodernism is Nietzsche. So he was a 19th century German philosopher, and he presented a critique of truth in favor of perspectivism. What this means is he essentially critiqued the idealists at the time who created a very sturdy and this is how the world operates, and said that there are multiple perspectives by which the world operates that you have to analyze it from. Through this, he created the theory of master-slave morality. A master morality refers to the judging of actions as they are, so what Descartes would do, what Hobbes would do, judging actions in a rationalist lens versus slave morality, which was more focused on intentions in order to determine whether or not an action is good or bad. This is what the Catholic Church would do and what religious figures would do in order to determine whether an action was good or bad. Most importantly, and what Nietzsche is known for in terms of postmodernism, is he characterized human subjectivity as being a bunch of competing wills and desires. What this means is that the human subjectivity was no longer explained by just a very robotic mindset that emphasized things like logic, but rather that there were different desires, different ways that humanity operated, and this is how they came to choose certain conclusions. It's also important that sometimes people will say that he's a Nazi, but it's really important that he was not a Nazi, because in debate people will use this as an argument. But his sister was a Nazi who sold all of his work after he died to Hitler, but Nietzsche himself would have very much disagreed with the fundamental tenets of Nazism. So another precursor to postmodernism is Marx. Marx is going to be super important because he was a 19th century German both philosopher and economist. He theorized the idea of historical materialism along with Friedrich Engels, who was another economist, and they created this idea that historical events are created by material conditions. In the past, people believed that historical events like the Crusades were all determined by things like religion or self-justified motives, but Marx says that these are caused by people's material living conditions. So, for example, if a strike is happening, it isn't because people want to create trouble, but rather because they are being underpaid, and that is something a result of their materiality. He creates this theory that class includes the bourgeoisie, these are the people who owns the means of productions, and the proletariat, those who sell their labor for a fixed value that is less than their actual value. So if I work in a car shop and my entire job is to fixate a window on a car, instead of being paid for how much the window is from the car, so if the car costs $20 and the window is $5, instead of being paid the $5 of the value that I produced, I'm paid a fixed wage of $2. That extra $3 then goes to the bourgeoisie because they own the ability from which I can make a cart, i.e. the machinery. Marx says that this is bad and there's always going to be a fundamental antagonism between these two classes. This is, he terms something called class consciousness, and he says that capitalism will collapse because of its own internal contradictions once the working class realizes that they are being exploited. The next precursor to postmodernism is Kierkegaard. So he was an early 19th century Danish philosopher, and he's considered the father of existentialism. Existentialism questions the existence of free will and whether or not we actually do anything, or whether everything is actually predetermined. And this is important because he focused on theological ethics, specifically Christianity. In a lot of Christian beliefs, it says that everything is predetermined, and this was specifically common around the area that Kierkegaard would have lived in, around like Sweden, Norway, places like that. And he rejected this idealism, evident in authors like Hegel, who said that everything can be quickly determined through logical reasoning, and said that this is something which is wrong, and also rejected a lot of these Christian morals. The next precursor to postmodernism is Heidegger. So Heidegger was a 20th century German philosopher, and he rejected the rationalist philosophy of Descartes, and specifically Descartes' idea of I think, therefore I am. And he said that that's not what constitutes being. And created this idea of ontology. Ontology, or the study of being, said that this is not what it means to be, but rather it is something else that is influenced by your outside perceptions, and creates specifically something called Dasein. Dasein refers to human existence, and he says that this is something that is shaped by ontology, and it is not something that can be introspectively created, such as what Descartes says. And he also criticized the use of nature within Western capitalism. This is going to be interesting, especially for Capcase, because Heidegger says that Western capitalism treats nature as a commodity. So a tree is not a tree, but rather it is something that can make paper and pencils. And he says that this is something that is bad. This was in the 1930s, so he predicted a lot of the ways that we see nature being commodified today. Another precursor to postmodernism is Lacan. So Lacan's interesting because he was a 20th century French psychoanalyst, but psychoanalysis is a clinical study of like psychology, but the way that he gets applied in debate is in a much more philosophical sense. There's two parts of Lacan. So there's first the structuralist Lacan. This was his more early work, and he thought that individual identity is created in the mirror stage, or when one realizes their image, and that creates tension. So what it means to realize your image is when you're a baby and you look in the mirror and you start moving and you realize that you exist in the world. Essentially there's this dissonance between what your previous perception was, which was harmonious and that like you exist but you're not a physical entity, and what it is after, which is, oh, you exist and there's some kind of perception of you, which is necessarily the image. Structuralism also refers to a theory of culture that implies that elements of human culture must be understood by their way of relationship to a broader system. So in this case, it's a question of how like human relationships are created with in respect to a broader language of human development. Poststructuralist Lacan thought that language was an expression of desire. Poststructuralism refers to basically the rejection of ideas of structuralism, and basically created this idea that meaning is not stable and is dependent upon the interpreter rather than the structure. So this Lacan would say that language can be interpreted in a variety of ways, but fundamentally it is an expression of desire. Here he creates the idea of the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic. These are the three registers of the mind that Lacan theorized that language operates within. So they basically served to simulate subjectivity within a system of perception in a dialogue of the external world. However, this wasn't the only one. There was a fourth register of the world, which isn't discussed as much. The symptom just basically means the symptom, and basically refers to the idea of topology, which says that this symptom is itself something that cannot be interpreted. In this way, it's almost like a rejection of a lot of what his earlier works were about. Another precursor to postmodernism was Bataille. So Bataille was another 20th century French philosopher. He influenced the school of poststructuralism, as we just talked about, and he became very much obsessed with the idea of human sacrifice and ritual sacrifice after studying a lot of indigenous and Latin American cultures. He believed that the notion of excess energy and its existence in society was something that was always going to be commodified under capitalism, and sacrifice was a necessary means of unproductivity in order to hedge back against this. He also used Spinoza's literature base of neutral monism to develop base materialism. Neutral monism, of course, refers to the philosophy of the mind, which basically says that reality and how we perceive things is neither mental nor physical. Instead, it is something that is neutral and isn't either of those. And he uses this in terms of base materialism, which refers to the concept, like basically breaking against mainstream materialism, and says that like idealism isn't correct either, but base materialism means that it's not either one of those. It is not simply idealist, but it is not simply physicalist either. In conclusion, postmodernism is a rejection of Enlightenment-style ideals. There are many authors who can be considered postmodernists. And there are authors who weren't postmodernists who are mentioned here, but also set the stage for postmodern ideology.